Okay, we're just on the lunch break of day 26 of the Undercover Policing Inquiry, Tranche 2, Phase 2. We have been listening to the live evidence this morning of Callum, who was a Hunt-Sab, Animal Liberation Front activist, went on to get very involved in helping with the ALF supporters group. I'm joined with Kate Wilson. Kate, what did you make of the evidence this morning?
Well, it's kind of weird. It's my first hearing where the witness is behind a screen, so it's audio only, even if you're here. And
there are a lot of restriction orders.
There are a lot of restriction orders, which means I'm going to talk like Bob Lambert. I'm going to talk really slowly and kind of backtrack on things as I think about what I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So we're on to Andy Coles now. This is the infiltration by Andy Coles. It's kind of interesting. I mean, working backwards, the end of what Callum was saying was basically that he's not there in the reporting. Like, Callum spent 3 years spying on him, and he doesn't really. Coles spent 3 years spying on Callum, and he doesn't really understand why he wasn't pulled out after 12 months because he wasn't doing anything to bring him to the attention of the police.
Essentially what Andy Coles was doing was just helping out with the ALFSG, picking up the newsletter from the printers, taking them to Callum's home where he lived with his partner and child. He would walk their dog, hang out with them, filling the envelopes to send out the newsletters. He would also help out with stalls, but it was very low level stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, there was quite a nice bit where we looked at HN2, Andy Coles' post-operation debrief, and Callum just looked at it and said, well, he's blowing his own trumpet there. Most of what he's saying he did, I was doing. And even then, it's not, this is not illegal stuff. I wasn't totally clear. I got the impression that, towards the end, that he felt that, because although he wasn't doing anything to bring him to the attention of the police, I get the impression that ALFSG people have been prosecuted for doing the stuff that the ALFSG does. So, running stalls, producing leaflets, producing the newsletter, and that he seemed to think that Coles had maybe been involved in, providing evidence for those prosecutions, and that there may actually be some, despite the fact that nobody was doing anything illegal, there may be some miscarriages of justice involved. I mean, this brings us back to the stuff about Viv Smith and Ronnie Lee, and that, they weren't prosecuted for doing ALF actions. They were prosecuted for talking about them. Yeah.
Same for Robin Lane.
Yeah, we should probably be careful what we say here, because we're going to get done for incitement and conspiracy.
It is quite difficult. I mean, there is we were allowed to say that he was involved in a legal case whilst he was involved with the ALFSG. He was found not guilty in that case, but the role of Coles in him being arrested in the first place seems fairly significant, and the fact that was left out of the trial is suggesting miscarriage of justice. He talked as well about how the reporting on his child by Andy Coles, and that this guy kind of played with his child, and there was no need for him to report on him, but he did, which was, you see how distasteful that was. There was section about that.
I think we see more of this, and there are actually, going forward into other tranches, there are people who are now adults who as children were babysat and looked after and befriended by undercover cops when they were quite small.
We heard a lot about that from Lambert, where he was known as the babysitter amongst some people because he did it so often.
Yeah, he was he would send everyone else off to the pub, and he'd stay back with the kids, which I think there's really big ethical questions over that. I find it's very unpleasant to think of. Yeah.
We also heard a lot of the first half of Callum's questioning, really focused on his time before he ends up going to prison as an ALF prisoner following the poll tax protest in the March of 1990. But before that, he had been very involved as a Hunt-Sab, and we heard a lot about the really extreme violence that the huntsmen were using against hunters. I wasn't. There were certain aspects of it that we weren't allowed to talk about. But I mean, it really underscored just how violent the hunts, particularly certain hunts, we're not allowed to name which particular hunts, were using really extreme violence on Hunt-Sabs who were behaving perfectly peacefully and lawfully, but were disrupting the hunts.
Yeah. I mean, this has been a recurring theme, and it's something that. Going forward, I've seen a lot of the disclosure going forward into tranche 4. So we're talking, 20 years after the events that we're talking about now. And, in the run-up to the passing of the Hunting Act that made it all illegal and proved the Huntsab's right, essentially, is that they use this idea that hunt sabotage means violence. And you see it in the police, and we've seen it in the reporting about Lambert, we've seen it in some of the other stuff, that the police are well aware where the violence is coming from, but they just leave that out, and they use the Huntsabbing a lot to justify operations, to justify getting the funding for what they're doing. And, they talk about GBH, they talk about, serious violence, and they just, in their private meetings, in their private memos, you can see that they know they're concerned for their own officers' safety in these situations. But in the public-facing documents, in the annual reports, in the applications for authority, they talk about how hunt sabotage involves serious violence, and they're very quiet about who is perpetrating that violence. And spying on the victims of violence, even for the Metropolitan Police, is pretty dodgy stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it continued, we've seen it right throughout, and we're going to see it all the way through the whole thing. I thought Callum was a really good witness. I think it was very, very clear. There was, after a week of listening to Bob Lambert and his way of talking, it was so refreshing to have somebody who sounded like an adult, basically.
Bob Lambert is not a hard act to follow, I have to say. I do think that Callum was a good witness, but Lambert is not a hard act to follow. I thought, a lot of the stuff that he was saying, I don't know what's going to come out in the transcripts, but a lot of it was quite interesting around how, and I think this is something quite interesting when you look, you get it when you look back at the anti-apartheid movement as well, is talking about the way that Huntsabs responded to the massive threat of violence that they were experiencing. So, they're committed to non-violent. Well, it's not just, in the case of Huntsabbing, it's not just that they were committed to non-violence, it's that they were committed to sabotaging the hunt and saving the animals, and actually hanging around fighting with a bunch of terrier men is not, that just means the hunters can get on and do what they're doing. So, the direct action approach, and I think it's worth stressing this quite a lot, direct action does not mean violence. They're kind of using it in the inquiry a bit like it does. Direct action means directly affecting the outcome that you are trying to achieve, and in this case the outcome they were looking for was to save the animal, and any violence was to stop them achieving that aims, and engaging with that violence instead of engaging with what they were doing was counterproductive to what they were doing. And I think there was a lot of interesting stuff about that, and about how they dealt with the violence, how they avoided the violence, how they, tried to put off. And, there was a lot of stuff about them all wearing the same clothes and wearing masks in order to look more intimidating, so that it would be less enticing to start trying to beat them up.
Yeah. And also so that the hunters didn't know if they were beating up a small woman or a large man. Most of the time they were all wearing the same camo jackets, the same masks, and it was this sort of this projection to sort of kind of suggest that it wasn't, that there was some risk involved in them being beaten up. They talked about a lot about that they would have, if you had a seriously violent incident at a hunt, the following meet would be a joint hit from multiple Huntsab groups, who would really show that if you're going to beat us up when there's only 20 of us, when there's 300 of us, you can still beat us up and the hunt will still get stopped. There's no way you're going to be able to stop the hunt being sabbed with that many people. Yeah,
this is something also that we've heard a few times, is this idea of the Huntsab's response to serious violence was numbers. It was always okay, we'll have a national event where people come from all over the country to show support, to show that we will not be forced to back down by violence. So if there is really intense violence on a hunt, you can be pretty sure that your next hunt is just not going to happen, because there's going to be hundreds of people there making sure it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, this has been one of the parts of the inquiry that's been one of the most interesting, is this social history, right? We talk about it quite often when we're doing these videos, that there's so much about what really is kind of not forgotten, but is kind of a bit hidden from the history of around protest. And so much around Huntsabbing has been fascinating, really, to hear from so many people who were involved at the time and what it was really like. And I think it's a bit of an education as well, certainly for the inquiry itself, who still doesn't seem quite to get it. Another thing they don't get is the nature of the ALF. We saw a lot of conflating of the ALF supporters group and actual ALF activism today, again, in the reports of Andy Coles and elsewhere. I think Callum did a great job of pointing out the reality of the situation and, suggest, yes, it did happen that people, particularly very young people and teenagers who were writing to the ALF SG, didn't get the difference either, but they would write back and explain what the difference was. And that was kind of it. I mean, it's kind of funny that now, so many years later, he's explaining to an octogenarian the nature of these things were different. But it's been, I think it was very good witness. Is there anything else you want to add before we go to lunch?
Well, just to say that one of the things that we're seeing quite clearly is that if you want a social history of the ALF, the undercover police reports about the ALF are definitely not the places to go. I mean, if you read these reports, it's basically anybody who didn't think torturing bunny rabbits for shampoo was a good idea was the ALF. And I mean, I think there's a very good reason for that, because the ALF were evidently very difficult to access, because people who were the ALF, they were small cells, they were not talking about it. The only person who successfully managed to do that, as far as I can tell, was Lambert. He did it by setting fire to a Debenhams department store, even though he's now not admitting that. But basically, the way that these officers scammed their salary was by reporting on anybody and everybody and saying that they were the ALF. So it's unpicking that is one of the things that the inquiry is doing with all of these different witnesses.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've got another animal liberation or animal rights activist this afternoon, Walter. I'm really not sure what the extent of the restriction orders are for him right this minute, so I'm not going to give too much of a preview about him, but it should be interesting. Starts about 2:10. Our tweets will start appearing about 2:20. We'll do one of these recaps at the end of the day again, and there'll be a Spaces this evening. Thanks for joining.